Hi everybody. Welcome to Applied Statistics for the Natural Sciences. I'm really glad you're here. And whether you're coming in with a strong stats background or this is all new, I'm hoping this class can help meet you where you are and take you to the next level with your statistics. Um, let's just jump right into the class. So, statistics for the natural sciences. What is this class all about? In a nutshell, we're going to learn statistical methods and then actually apply them to your own research. We're going to start with the fundamentals. Even though some of you have seen this material before, I'd really encourage you to revisit it. A lot of these concepts aren't super intuitive, and a refresher doesn't hurt. So, after the foundational material, you'll get to choose your own adventure at that point. We're going to do deep dives into community ecology, population ecology, spatial distribution modeling, among other things. And so, you can really tailor this course to your actual work and your needs. Um, the course is really set up to be asynchronous friendly. So if you've already had solid stats background, you can move through the material more quickly. Though I do think working with your classmates and kind of internalizing some of these lessons would be really helpful. I don't want this class, though, to add stress to your life. I want it to support you as you work on your thesis, your dissertation, or even your proposals getting ready for those, kind of big graduate school events. At the end of each chapter, there's a really short assignment associated with your work. There are quizzes that you can take and retake to reinforce what you've learned. But your main grade is going to come from a project, and that's essentially either the draft or your methods for your proposal or a result section for your thesis. So I want it to be very applied and very relevant to your graduate school work here. Um, I suggest watching the videos at home. It'd be really kind of weird to watch them in class. And then we can use class time to work through problems together. And I'll be there to help. Okay. So here's something I want you to hold on to throughout this whole course. Statistics gets a little crazy and there's lots of complex language, but almost every statistical test that you'll run boils down to answering one of two questions. And here they are. Do these groups differ, or is there a relationship between two variables? And that's really it. We have a bunch of fancy formulas and Greek letters, but really, we're talking about ways to get at these kind of foundational relationships and these kind of simple comparisons. Um, so that's very exciting. Now, you may be thinking, if it's really just like looking at two questions, why do we need to take this entire course? Well, that's really fair. One thing I would say is that the world is messy. This is actually why statistics has been developed. We know that data are noisy. We know that we're never accurately sampling populations, which we'll talk about. And so even though those are simple questions, we have to use statistics to be able to answer them. So that is kind of the magic of statistics. They allow us to say something meaningful about the world based on a relatively small number of very imperfect observations. And that's kind of genuinely incredible when you think about it. So, early statisticians realized that ecological systems are super noisy, samples are imperfect, and we almost never get to observe the entire population. You can imagine something along the lines of like you're trying to measure every rare plant in the world of a particular species. But think about all of the different aspects of doing that. What would that mean to really sample the true population, meaning like the entirety of that rare species? You'd have to know exactly where all those species are. You'd have to know where their seeds are. You'd have to know that there weren't like nest little buddies in there hanging out and not able to be measured. The point is, we're never, ever in ecology sampling the entire population ever. We're always working with a sample. So, in order to extend conclusions from a sample to the bigger picture, statisticians had to develop ways to quantify uncertainty. And, just a note, I've been bantering about populations. When statisticians say populations, it doesn't mean the same thing as when a ecologist says it. So they mean what they're talking about here is whatever it is that you're focused on measuring. So, and that it's referring to the entire known group of, or the entire group of those of that entire population. So it means whatever it is that you're interested in looking at. That could be something like grasshoppers or of a particular species, or all of the pinyon juniper woodland communities. Those are examples of population. So it's more loosey-goosey. And again, a sample is just a subset of that population that you're actually able to observe and measure. So again, the whole game of statistics is going from that sample to being able to draw a reliable conclusion about an entire population. Okay, we basically have two major schools of thought in statistics. And there's all kinds of statistics and some things that might even fall in between these two realms, but we're going to kind of break things down so you kind of know what we're talking about here. These two major schools of thought are frequentist statistics and Bayesian statistics. You've probably heard both terms, but let's take a minute to talk about what each one means and where we're focusing. So Bayesian approaches are built on Bayes' theorem, which is here in this slide. And at its core, Bayes' theorem is a rule of probability that formalizes how we learn from data. So it combines what we already knew before collecting data, that's referred to as the prior, with information from our observed data in order to produce an updated belief about some unknown parameter. Think of it like this. You start with an educated guess, you collect data, and then you update your guess based on what you found. So this is just kind of in a nutshell what Bayesian statistics do. So this approach is particularly useful in a couple of situations. First, when you already have a really solid prior information. So this might be previous studies of your system, expert knowledge, long-term monitoring, and you want to kind of formally incorporate that into your analysis. Second, when your sample sizes are too small or your data are really sparse, the prior information can stabilize your estimates in ways that frequentist methods sometimes can't. Third, Bayesian statistics allows you to make direct probability statements about your parameters. So in other words, you can say things like, there's a 90% probability that this effect is positive, which is actually a really intuitive way to communicate results. And fourth, they're really great for complex hierarchical models, which are super common in ecology, things like nested sampling designs, random effects, latent processes, all that stuff. So finally, when uncertainty itself is what you care about the most, like in forecasting or management decisions, Bayesian methods can really shine. They carry that uncertainty through every step of the analysis. But now that we've discussed how useful Bayesian statistics are, I'm going to let you in on a secret. We are mainly going to focus on frequentist statistics. And here's why. So most ecologists work within a frequentist framework. Frequentist thinking lines up naturally with how we design experiments and we collect data. And most classical ecological methods, think t-tests, ANOVAs, regressions, they're all built on frequentist foundations. So historically, Bayesian methods were really computationally very difficult, which kind of limited their use. And because of that legacy, most ecological journals still expect to see things like p-values and confidence intervals in your results. And these are from these frequentist applications. So I've actually had colleagues that work primarily in Bayesian stats, and they've sometimes had real challenges being able to get the work published, not because the science was bad, but because the reviewers weren't comfortable with that framework. So since frequentist statistics really get the job done for most analyses, and since that's what you're most likely to encounter in the literature or in peer review, that's where we're going to start. Okay, so what is frequentist statistics? Oh, here's the textbook definition. It's a framework for statistical inference where parameters are treated as fixed but unknown, and uncertainty is quantified by how our estimates and procedures would behave under repeated sampling. That sounds dense, but let's break that down a little bit. The idea is that there is some true value out there, a true mean, a true effect size, and it's fixed. It's not random. It's there, it exists. But the data that we collect It is random. It has characteristics of randomness. Every time we go out and sample, we get slightly different numbers. Every time we try to draw a sample, we might get different individuals. And so frequentist statistics ask, given the randomness in our sampling and our ability to gather information, how confident can we be about that true value? And so that's kind of the core idea of frequentist statistics. And we're going to go over how it does that. And I think it'll become more clear through time what we're actually doing. Okay, so I wanted to give a brief history because I think this is kind of fun and it might tie in some folks and some concepts that you've heard in the past. Okay, so buckle up. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of frequentist statistics, and it won't be too dense, but it'll just be hopefully a little bit fun. Okay, so let's start back in the 1700s and 1800s with early astronomers and physicists. These folks noticed something puzzling. They would measure the same thing under the same conditions, but they always got slightly different values, slightly different numbers. Nothing had changed in the system, and yet these measurements varied. That observation led to a really important insight. Variation is not just noise to be ignored. It's something that should be modeled, that we can model. So rather than treating differences among measurements as mistakes, scientists began to describe them mathematically. This is where we've basically developed the normal distribution. It was around this time, the classic bell curve that everyone knows. It became the go to model for random measurement error. The assumption was that this error is symmetric, unbiased, and the result of lots of small random influences adding up. And here's the foundational frequentist idea that came out of this. Data vary because of random error, not because underlying parameters are random. So not the thing that we're actually looking to measure. That's not random. It is because of our data. The data themselves introduce this randomness. Okay, and classic folks like Galileo, Newton, Gauss, they were all key figures in this era. The other name for the normal distribution is a Gaussian distribution, and that's why. It's because of this guy, Gauss. Okay, so next, we kind of come into the 1800s, and this is where probability itself gets a very specific definition within the frequentist framework. Instead of probability being about belief, like I think there is a good chance of rain, it becomes about long run frequency. So, what would happen if we repeated that same process many, many times? This reframes uncertainty as a property of repeated sampling, not personal belief. The parameters we're trying to estimate, means, treatment effects, they're treated as fixed but unknown. What varies from sample to sample is the data. So, statistical inference isn't just about what we observed in our one study, it's about what would happen across many hypothetical repetitions of that study. That's a subtle shift in thinking that really laid the foundation for frequentist statistics. And we'll get into it more next time when we start to talk a little bit more about probability. Okay, sampling distributions. This is very important to us and probably something you've heard a little bit about, and you were just introduced to the Gaussian distribution. But as we move into the late 1800s and early 1900s, statisticians made another key realization. Even summary statistics like means, slopes, variances have their own distribution when you sample repeatedly. So if you went out, say, and collected 30 data points, calculated a mean, and then did it again and again and again, you get slightly different means each time. And then the distribution of all those means is called a sampling distribution. And this concept is the foundation for standard errors, confidence intervals, test statistics, basically all the tools you'll end up using in this class. So the key takeaway here is just that uncertainty in our estimates comes from the sampling variation. Okay, hypothesis testing. So now we're kind of moving into the early 1900s, and you might notice this picture of R.A. Fisher, who's very, very important in this time, in this particular time. This is when we start to get into formal hypothesis testing. So statisticians start asking, how surprising are these data if nothing actually is going on. So the nothing interesting scenario is the null hypothesis. You've probably had this in other classes. So that gives us kind of the apparatus of null hypotheses, test statistics, reference distributions, and the p-value, which Fisher himself ended up kind of helping us determine. Um, I I want to remember my cool R.A. Fisher stories. Basically, there was a kind of conflict in the sciences at this time with him and a couple of other folks who you probably would recognize. And the type of frequency statistics that we were reported is actually shockingly like like a mashup of these early statistical frameworks that was being, you know, put out there. So, and R.A. Fisher was really important to this scene. So we don't test whether a hypothesis is true. We test whether the data are inconsistent with it. And that distinction kind of matters. It's kind of that whole concept of we're not proving things in the sciences. And you can kind of think about it in a courtroom, right? When we're trying to convict someone, we're not necessarily trying to prove their innocence. We're trying to say, is there a possibility of innocence? Is there a possibility that they aren't guilty? So proven innocent until proven guilty, right? So it's a little bit analogous to that with this kind of classic distinction. Okay, so we won't be proving anything with statistics. We're just going to be looking at whether our data line up with our expectations. Perfect. So next, also in the 1900s, as the field developed, statisticians started to realize that different types of data needed different models. You can't treat count data in the same way that you would treat continuous measurements. So from this, we've already had our normal distribution for continuous traits like body mass or temperature, but we also start to develop the binomial distribution for binary outcomes like survival or presence absence, the Poisson distribution for count data, and then other derived distributions that are out there, which we'll also go into. So the core principle here is really straightforward. The statistical model that you use must match the data that you are generating. So we'll spend some time on that as we start to get into selecting different model types. Okay, well, and that brings us up to the modern toolbox. All of those foundational ideas expanded into the methods that we see today: linear models, generalized linear models, mixed effects models, likelihood based inference, AIC, all of these different things kind of develop from that core. And these are the tools that you'll actually be learning and using in this course. But despite how sophisticated they've become, the foundation hasn't changed. Inference is still based on error distributions, repeated sampling logic. And everything we just walked through in this history section is baked into every analysis that you'll end up running. Okay, so this is where our journey begins. Now you have a sense of the big picture, what statistics is, where it came from, why it matters for your work, and we're ready to start digging into the details. So we will start in the next session, kind of building out some of our foundational concepts step by step. And I'd just like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.